Hello and welcome to Dialogue. In recent weeks, China and the EU have seen both high-level diplomacy and rising trade tensions. European Commission President von der Leyen has accused China of distorting trade and limiting market access, claims strongly rejected by China's foreign and commerce ministries as misrepresenting reality and overlooking progress in bilateral talks. So what's fueling the friction between the two sides, and also why is the NATO chief adopting a confrontational stance toward China just as the EU-China summit approaches? And how might the U.S. tariff policy shape the future of China-EU trade relations? Join us for our discussion today, live from Beijing. I'm Xu Qinduo. Joining me today are Pascal Coppens, keynote speaker and author on Chinese innovation, Professor Diesen from the University of South-Eastern Norway, and later on, Victor Gao Zhikai, chair professor at Soochow University. Welcome to Dialogue. Glenn, I will start with you. Von der Leyen's, accusation against China covers different aspects. One of the outstanding criticism is basically China's relationship with Russia. Some people say, this is her strongest criticism of China to date. On Tuesday, she talked about China, basically helping Russia. In his words, China is enabling Russia, quote, de facto enabling Russia's war economy through continued ties and support. Yes, for our listeners, overseas, China adopts different policy from the European Union, from the US. China is not imposing sanctions on Russia. China is continuing normal relationship, including business relationship with Russia. And that had been, a complaint of focus from the European Union. So Glenn, I want to have an opinion on that. Basically, the pain point remains there?
Well, it's worth noting that 85% of the world's population live in countries which have not imposed sanctions on Russia. And this has been part of the frustration of the Europeans and the Americans, that they haven't been able to get the rest of the world on board. If we remember at the beginning, more or less three goals were set. That is to defeat Russia on the battlefield, destroy its economy, and isolate it internationally. And it failed essentially in all three objectives. So it looks towards China as the main strategic partner of Russia. But again, this hostility towards China, which you referred to, it's worth noting that this began well before 2022. Often we point towards the issue of Taiwan, for example, but China's position on Taiwan hasn't changed in the past few years. So the main thing that has changed is that China is becoming very powerful, and it views Russia as a key strategic partner, which is why this is a natural partnership to seek to break up and pit China against Russia. Now, of course, this is, I think, going to be a very failed strategy, because we keep hearing from the United States that as well, that if they can just use the Ukrainians to knock out Russia from the ranks of great powers, then the US could focus its resources on countering China. So it's difficult to see why China would assist in this. But this being said, the Chinese are also sending, for example, drones to the Europeans, to the Ukrainians, as well as the Russians. So to portray this as China having entered the war is very wrong. As opposed to the Europeans, the Chinese have not entered the war. So I think it's all about, it's mixing objectives. It's putting pressure on China, hoping it will distance itself from Russia, but it also becomes a tool in the toolbox to legitimize some of the economic sanctions or the trade war against China. Because we have to be honest, the key problem here with China getting more powerful is that the Europeans and the Americans aren't really capable anymore of competing against the Chinese economy. And if you're still ideologically committed to the principle of free trade, then you need some reasons to intervene in the markets.
Mm-hmm. Well, speak of the competition, with China or with the U.S. Pascal, another issue when the line raised is so-called overcapacity. I mean, to be sure, overcapacity is a line previously used by the U.S. against the import of the Chinese EVs. Basically to build a wall against the Chinese EVs. So, well, the European Union also imposed a sort of restrictions on import of the Chinese EVs too. But she's again talking about overcapacity. Tell us more about this issue, overcapacity here.
Yeah, I wrote a long piece about overcapacity just recently, a few days ago, because I think the real issue is that this has become a buzzword in Europe, really against China to deal with mostly an internal issue that Europe has these days. So the issue of overcapacity, in my view, is not so much excess, it's actually the limitation of Europe in terms of industrial base as well as innovation. And so that Europe is worried makes total sense. I mean, they should be worried because there's something really changing. And that change, in my view, is not so much about just building capacity in order to flood the markets in Europe, but a market-driven innovation model that Europe is not familiar with and that is being used very well in China. And what that means is that where we in Europe, and I'm European, what we do is we build value from innovation, and then we scale that. We go into volume and capacity. While the Chinese, they often do the opposite. They start with capacity, and then they build value over time. And the reason they do that is because innovation is done very much in an iteration way of doing it. And it's also very competitive. It's very localized. So you need, in a way, a lot of capacity to build that innovation out. And that's a model that is bottom up. It's a market-driven model that China had created and built its big ecosystems because of that. And Europe is not familiar with that. And so when they fight the volume coming from China, they're actually fighting a volume that has come, that is linking to innovation. And so if we would talk about the past and talk about, for example, the low labor industries like textiles in the past, or maybe things like high capital, like steel and so on, that's a different topic. But today, it's all about innovation. And if that innovation model flips, which means the Chinese building from volume to value, and we're building from value to volume, we're actually confronting each other with two business models. And it's very difficult, in my view, from Beijing to control how China is innovating because it's going from the bottom up. Of course, if it's about capital investment, that's a different thing. But these days, it's much more from the market. And so I do believe that Europe is looking at it completely wrong these days and not understanding that they have to look at an innovation model. And the risk is that we are protecting our volume, or the volume from China, and doing that in a way that is completely not going to be effective because of that. What we should do is actually go back to 100 years ago. The founder of the European Union, or the architect, was Jean Monnet, and he got Germany and France together to actually build a lot of volume in steel, and by doing that, they build a lot of value. And that's the model that China's been using for the past decades, and it works very well. So I think unless we go back to 100 years to get our model back, I think we're going to have a hard time to understand what China's doing.
On that point, Glenn, Jamie Dimon was recently in the European Union, I think in Ireland, he talked about the European economy in a very direct manner, basically said, quote, "You are losing." He said Europe has gone from 90% of US GDP to 65% of US GDP over 10 to 15 years. Obviously, something wrong with the economy itself.
No, I think it's, a lot of things that's wrong. But I agree with what Pascal just said. That is that the Europeans, when Europe was able to develop itself after World War II, it was based on this very powerful industrial capitalism. And they focused on the key industries, building this competitiveness. The key weakness of the Europeans is that since the single market, it hasn't been that much focus. Indeed, if you look back at some of the EU documents from the 1990s, the early 1990s, they used the language of the concern of becoming a technological colony of the United States and Japan, again, in the 90s, because they didn't develop sufficiently the digital technologies. And you see what has happened now 30 years into the future, we have none of the big the digital platforms as you see in China or the United States. So the Europeans have failed to get on board with this new industrial revolution. And as we see more and more of traditional industries becoming, well, taken over or at least reformed by digital industries, the Europeans keep falling behind. And this is the key problem. The Europeans are becoming less and less competitive, and they're relying more on their traditional industries. But even in these traditional industries, such as the German heavy industries, which are energy dependent, they're also being lost now at a breakneck speed, simply because we lost access to cheap Russian energy when we cut ourselves off from this. So I think this is the main problem. And this lack of economic competitiveness, the lack of technological sovereignty, this translates into a lot of political insecurity, because the game of geoeconomics entails you want to develop asymmetrical interdependence. You want others to be more dependent on you, ideally for your technologies, and for you to be less dependent on others. We're seeing now a massive shift. The Europeans are becoming dependent on everyone, while the EU itself is losing its relevance. So the concern, therefore, is that the excessive asymmetrical interdependence will lead to shifting political loyalties, where the Europeans will have to fall more and more in line. So this is the wider problem, both an economic and a political problem, as the Europeans failed to adjust to a new economy and new technologies.
Right. Yes. I mean, it's developed rapidly. We have Victor now with us. Victor, von der Leyen, brought the so-called overcapacity issue to the table again, accusing China of, quote, flooding global markets with subsidized overcapacity, not just to boost its own industries, but to choke international competition. Very harsh words. China's Ministry of Commerce responded that there's no overcapacity in China's new energy industry from a global perspective. And in the medium and long term, but a capacity gap. In fact, China's green products are helping Europe carry out its green transformation, as Europe is showing anxiety over its own insufficient R&D investment and the decline of industrial competitiveness. So what do you make of that? Like China's largest export market actually is ASEAN countries. It's not in the EU. We don't hear that kind of complaint from Southeast Asian countries, but here is von der Leyen obviously complaining loudly. What do you make of that, Victor?
Thank you very much for having me. I found von der Leyen's remarks shocking and ludicrous. Let me give you one example. Talking about electric vehicles, the real competition is not between Europe versus China or between Germany versus China. The real competition involving the EV industry is between the ICE cars or the fuel cars on the one hand versus the EV cars on the other hand. It is time for Europe to make that leap of faith, to embrace the EV car revolution, which means that they need to really make a breakthrough sooner or later. And as a matter of fact, sooner rather than later, breaking away from the fuel car industry. For many reasons, we do not need to go into details. That means calling the Chinese EV revolution as overcapacity is completely mischaracterizing the situation. Try to force Europe not to speed up in embracing the EV car revolution is the worst thing you can do as a European leader for the European automobile industry. Seemingly saving the ICE industry in Europe is, as a matter of fact, and in a philosophical point, a recipe for the final death of the ICE industry in Europe. Therefore, my advice to von der Leyen is to wake up and really do something in the fundamental interest of the European countries and of the European people. Again, using EV car as an industry. Embrace EV car as quickly as possible and enable China and Europe to cooperate in the EV car revolution. And China can really offer, for example, technological know-how, expertise, capital, experience, you name it, just like European car makers back 40 years ago, for example, did their part in helping China to grow the ICE industry. It is time for China and Europe to cooperate rather than, as von der Leyen said, try to be blocking China-EU cooperation. And I think the accusation von der Leyen made about China is completely shocking. China is not providing overcapacity. China is the true representative of high efficiency and the best way practice in many industries, including the EV car revolution. And there are so many other examples, and I hope von der Leyen will see the transformation and enable Europe to cooperate fully with China.
Of course, other aspects, the robotics, AI, and solar panel, wind turbine, etc. Pascal, do you think there's a way, by cooperating with each other on EV, both sides can benefit actually from the development of the industry at the same time? This is a part of the efforts against climate change. This is really like a win-win-win situation. Can we achieve that between China and Europe?
Well, I believe that Europe will have no choice in the way that if they want to reach their climate goals, they have to collaborate with China. And I think von der Leyen also understands, because that's kind of the exception that she wants to put in there, is like, let's collaborate on the green industries. The problem is that it's not just about EVs. It's not just about solar panels. It's about the whole industry. Every industry is becoming more sustainable these days. So a lot of sustainable products, whatever industry it is, are depending on some products that come from China. And this has a lot to do with the innovation that China has built over the past years. I totally agree with what Victor says. The only challenge I see is that because of this trust issue between China and the European Union right now, is that it's difficult for Brussels to accept that they would become dependent on China, for example, for EVs, on batteries, and maybe 50 to 70% of the car these days, of the EV cars, to actually say we're only going to go into EVs, because then they're becoming very vulnerable. I think that's the mindset that is actually tricking Europe to continue in this protective mindset. Well, in a way, this could also be a way of collaborating and say, okay, what do you need in China from us that we could give you? And there's a lot of things that we don't talk about, but that should be like food from the Netherlands, for example, or there's many advanced high tech that could come from Europe. There's a lot of things that China needs that Europe is not putting on the table. I think the real issue is here very much that they don't want that dependency on industries that China has basically, in many cases, almost a monopoly because of their innovation and their investments over decades. Basically, China saw the future before Europe saw it. And so now it's for Europe to catch up, and that's not an easy position to be in.
Yeah, it's a good point. Speak of the mindset. We'll come back to talk more on that, I guess. It's really, the Chinese side just seldom talk about like a dependency, or we depend too much on the U.S. But that's a reality. But we don't see that. Probably if that's a fault, it's our own fault, right? We depend on the U.S. high tech, imports. We also depend on the U.S. market. We depend on the European market. Two largest markets of foreign exports. So dependency is mutual here. But that's a cooperation. That's fine, right? And also rare earth is under the issue. Of course, is a current issue. Pascal, the Chinese side would say, China's export control of rare earths is in accordance with laws, with regulation. China has established actually a green channel for European enterprises to speed up approval, which the later, from the Chinese point of view, obviously failed to appreciate. Obviously, that was not mentioned by van der Leyen, by the European side. On the other side, China also criticized the delay in the approval of EU high-tech export control to the Chinese side. So, here, if you look at the China-U.S. relationship, yes, rare earth and the U.S. side talked to the Chinese side. They struck a deal, and the problem solved, at least temporarily. Can we do that for the European Union to talk to the Chinese side? Let's find a solution, how to solve this problem.
Yeah, I think we can, but it will take time. And I think Brussels or the European Union will have to figure out how dependent they are on these rare earths, and mostly how long it will take for Europe to build its own reserves. And the problem is not just to build the reserves, because rare earths are not so rare. The issue is the whole production. And that's where China for a decade, 2 decades, has been investing in not just the mining, but the whole fabrication of rare earths, and a lot of innovation went into that. And so we can learn actually a lot from China on how to do it better, to actually fabricate or produce these rare earths. And that could be a collaboration that we could definitely do. If you look at a company like Huawei, for example, I mean, they have made these mines completely automated. This is the highest technology that is available worldwide. We could follow that example because we want that strategic autonomy from rare earths. And this is nothing to do with China only. It has to do with the fact that we need, just like China, some resilience and some self-sufficiency on these minerals. So I think we would come to a deal. I just think this is a bargaining chip that will wait some time for von der Leyen to accept, simply because she will try every other possibility first and then hope that it will just fall into place just like it did in the US. But she doesn't like probably to use that or have rare earths being put on the table at this moment. So we'll see.
So Glenn, of course, the Chinese side also, the Ministry of Commerce, talking about the Vineline's, accusation, said she's being emotional and with prejudice, saying that more consultation and less labeling are needed. We talked about the mine site. If you look at the issue she raised, overcapacity is a term basically used by the U.S. during the Biden administration against the Chinese EVs, right? And the European side picked up that line, and against the Chinese side, she sticks to that. And also, de-risking policy is actually a variation from the U.S. decoupling policy. And also, many of the practices is a line from Washington Brussels is borrowing U.S. policy on China. But now the U.S. policy on China is different. But somehow Brussels is stuck with this old line. Do you see the possibility of a change? Washington has changed. Probably the reality has changed. Do you think Brussels is able to change?
Well, I think it takes longer time for Brussels to change simply because of the way it's governed. It's not a state. So for this reason, they often rely on this kind of labeling exactly to move all the countries in the same direction. It's often referred to as rhetorical entrapment as well. If you frame the trade disputes with China as being because of China cheating or overcapacity, these kind of things, it's very good to use these terms in order to get all member states on board. So it's much more difficult to change the direction of the ship once you actually put everyone on a course to confrontation with China. But also, as was suggested before, I think the main reason why the Europeans have a harder time is they're not as confident as the Americans on this, because the Europeans are much more dependent. Indeed, in the past, the collective hegemony of the West, it created a very comfortable position because everyone was dependent on the political West for its technologies, industrial needs, transportation corridors, banks, currencies, insurances, everything there is. So everyone was dependent on the West. West wasn't that dependent on anyone else. And this created a very favorable asymmetrical relationship. Now we see not only that with the rise of China, that the world is becoming less dependent on the West, but even as the West fragments, the Europeans are discovering that the West is not one entity. The Americans, they have a lot of this technological sovereignty, and the Europeans do not. So at the moment, a lot of the insecurity in Europe, it comes from both this geoeconomic shock because of the incompetitiveness with China and others, but also geopolitical shock because the whole international climate, which the European politicians were raised in, was this idea of the post-Cold War era of essentially perpetual collective hegemony on the West, and this ideological assumption that this was meant to be very sustainable. So given that everything's being flipped over very quickly, I don't think the Europeans have really found their place in the world now. They're suffering from very much a strategic ambiguity. Again, do they align with the Americans in order to and go against China in order to hope that they will be rewarded somehow by the Americans, or do they hedge against American unpredictability by aligning closer with China? At the moment, you see them going a bit in every direction. They realize they need closer relationship with China, but they're also willing to essentially join on any aggressive rhetoric against China in order to, well, increase their own stock value in the United States. So I think, in this new situation, there's a massive strategic vacuum. And I don't see any of the leaders in Europe being able to, well, effectively address this in a proper way.
Mm-hmm. Earlier we also talked about China's relationship with Russia. Victor, this is a NATO chief Mark Rutte said on Wednesday during a meeting with, I think, the German Chancellor Merz. He said, quote, "If China attacked Taiwan, Beijing would make a call to Moscow and ask Russia to keep us busy in this part of Europe." Of course, he called China basically, like a decisive enabler of Moscow's, war on Ukraine. From Chinese point of view, how do you look at that?
First of all, I think the current General Secretary of NATO used to be a very reasonable and rational person before he became the Secretary General of NATO. And now he's kind of losing his sanity. He's accusing China one way or another. And several very quick points. The Taiwan situation is completely an internal matter of China. And no foreign country, including NATO itself, has any justification to point an accusing finger at China. And I want to assure the Secretary General that Taiwan reunification will be achieved during his lifetime. So he will live to see the Taiwan reunification. Don't pretend to be shocked when that day happens. And whatever you can do, condemnation or sanctions, etc., will not divert China from eventually achieving national reunification. China is the only permanent member of the Security Council of the United Nations, which has not achieved full national reunification. So you want to block China's national reunification? Forget about it. It's a mission dead upon its arrival at your table. Secondly, I think what Europe needs is lasting peace for Europe rather than agitation for more and more war. And to wear geopolitics on the lips of Europe as a whole is not the best interest and best recipe to serve the fundamental interests of the European people. Europe needs to build peace rather than being forced to cough up to 5% each for the member states to pay for its national defense. Paying higher and higher amount for national defense is, philosophically speaking, a very unwise step to really boost your national security. Building lasting peace is a mission both in a philosophical sense as well as a political sense. And for Europe as a whole, don't pretend you are a major player in geopolitics. Focus on peace, focus on economic development, and do something that Deng Xiaoping used to say. Development is the hard truth. Without development, you hollow out your national security. You hollow out your European-wide security as a whole. So focus on really what matters rather than on all these bells and whistles, which eventually will not save Europe.
With that, we are coming to the end for today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.